Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on your time zone. I'm Mark Cladis, a faculty member here at Brown, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to a lecture by our very own Professor David Frank. I am excited that David is here with us today. I always learn so much from him. His presentation today is titled Invasion Biology and the Ethics of Biodiversity. His presentation will last for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, so that will leave us with plenty of time for a discussion afterwards. Please send your questions and comments by way of the Q&A feature on your webinar screen. Now, before I introduce David, I do want to tell you briefly about environmental humanities at Brown. And before I do that, I would like us to pause and take a moment to acknowledge that Brown is built on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples, among other indigenous peoples. I also wish to acknowledge that Brown University, Providence, and Rhode Island more generally profited from the slave trade and from various industries dependent on slavery. Okay, let me now tell you about EHAB, that is Environmental Humanities at Brown. EHAB is a vital intellectual community, a community focused on environmental learning, teaching, and research in the humanities. But the humanities with strong interest in the sciences and public policy. We're a community of faculty, postdocs, grad students, undergrads, members of the local community, all working together to create something to nourish our hearts and minds as scholars, as activists. So I encourage you to visit our website, just search Environmental Humanities at Brown, visit our website, come to our events, join us. For example, share the courses that you're teaching on our website, or join the steering committee and help direct the future of environmental humanities at Brown. All are welcome. And finally, I would like to thank the Kogut Institute of the Humanities. They have been a wonderful home for us, supportive, bright, wise in every way. We're especially grateful for the expert leadership and the assistance of Amanda, Troude, Alice, and Damien. Thank you. Thank you very much for your support. And thank you as well to the Brown Media Services for your support. So today, a special thanks goes out to she and to Jason. Okay, so now I have the pleasure, the honor of introducing my colleague, Professor David Frank. The first time I met David, much of the world had just locked down due to COVID. And I was interviewing David on Zoom for a postdoc position. It was a Mellon postdoc secured by the Kogut with the home appointment in philosophy in the field of environmental philosophy. We wanted someone who would fit in the philosophy department naturally, but also someone whose research and teaching appeal to a greater humanities audience. David was the perfect choice. His expertise is on the often implicit values and ethics that drive, or at least that are manifested in the environmental sciences. His work then is not only central to environmental humanities, but it reaches out to and engages with the environmental sciences as well. Indeed, David has almost as many publications in biology and the environmental sciences as he does in philosophy. David earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Texas in 2012, and he has since held postdoctoral positions at New York University, the University of North Carolina, and the University of Tennessee. His current research focuses on the ethics and economics of the Green New Deal, the ethics of environmental health research, and on philosophical controversies about invasive species, which we're about to hear about today. I should also mention, finally, that today's talk, Invasion Biology and the Ethics of Biodiversity, it's something of a primer for us today. It's to help us prepare for a major conference next spring on a similar topic that will be hosted by IBIS, the COGIT, and Environmental Humanities. So I am just delighted that Professor Frank is presenting for us today. So thank you so much, David.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mark. And thanks to Trouda and the COGIT staff and the IT staff and the Environmental Humanities at Brown Initiative for inviting me to speak. Let me just share my screen. I also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. Since as an environmental humanist of sorts, I appreciate their purpose in alerting us to the ethical and political issues and questions raised by place and locality, deep history, and those who call for decolonization as the repatriation of land, but also because colonialism is actually central to the story I'm going to tell about species introductions, many of which, or most of which, have occurred after 1492 and have been accelerating with the growth of global capitalism and its characteristic travel and trade. So these are some of the questions I'd like to try to answer today for all of us, keeping in mind that there is, as Leonard Cohen might have said, there's a war between those who say there is a war between humans and introduced species and those who say there isn't. And so I'm gonna, keeping all of this controversy around this field in mind, I'm gonna try to talk a little bit about what invasion biology is, a little bit about its history, and particularly how it's value laden. And relatedly, I'd like to address this issue of whether invasion biology perpetuates a kind of myth of wilderness. And then finally, thinking about, the application of environmental ethics, what could justify invasion biologists' concern with introduced species, and what could justify some of the management programs that they advocate, many of which are controversial, as we'll see. So invasion biologists study non-native and introduced and invasive species. And like other environmental sciences, embedded within invasion biology are philosophical and ethical assumptions. So I'll start with just illustrating this with the field's kind of definitions of central terms. So for example, non-native distinguishes anthropogenic or human-caused dispersal from natural dispersal, where those species that are introduced by humans across biogeographic barriers to natural dispersal are those considered non-native. This definition seems to separate humans from the broader biota, perhaps because of humans' technologically aided mobility and ability to disperse plants and animals almost anywhere in the world, or perhaps because of an ethical commitment to non-anthropocentric values, which I'll talk about later. Similarly, invasive species are usually defined as those introduced species that establish and spread, or as a subset of those that cause problems, whether for human health, infrastructure, agriculture, or again, the broader environment, the broader biota. So these latter definitions generally involve making value judgments about the effects of introduced species and calling any introduced species that establishes a population in a recipient environment an invader also presupposes kind of complex value judgments, at the very least insofar as the term has obvious and negative connotations with that military metaphor again. So like its close relatives, conservation biology and restoration ecology, invasion biology arose in the mid to late 20th century as a value-laden science of biological conservation, one that speaks the language of ethics and values, good, bad, ought not, as much as it speaks the scientific language of developing explanatory and predictive theories, testing hypotheses with data, and so on. In the 1970s and 1980s, these scientists documented anthropogenic loss of species and declared a biodiversity crisis. But decades before, the ecologist Charles Elton was thinking about the conservation implications of some damaging introduced species and used the military metaphor in the title of his 1958 book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. But scientific interest in introduced species goes back at least to the beginnings of biogeography in the generation or two before Darwin. And Darwin discussed introduced species in the origin, at least in part because their success in recipient environments illustrates that species distributions are kind of contingent matters of history and dispersal and not special creation. So as an environmental philosopher, I've recently been engaged in a research project trying to understand controversies about invasive species and invasion biology, ethically and philosophically, through studying the scientific, social scientific, philosophical, and popular literatures, invasion biology textbooks, and doing participant observation research on the ethics of the management of the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive adelgid bug that sucks the sap of particularly eastern hemlock, where it's in its introduced range, with the laboratory of invasion biologist and ecologist Dan Simberloff, while I was teaching at the University of Tennessee. So these collaborative projects, these two in particular in these corners, involve thinking about off-target risks of chemical and biological control of the hemlock woolly adelgid. Additionally, on my own, I published a paper in the Philosophy of Science journal Synthèse, trying to be even-handed in the debate about science denialism about invasive species, arguing that much of the debate is driven by differences in values, and such diversity might actually be beneficial to the field in epistemic or scientific ways, and also in philosophical or ethical ways. So just going back to my title slide and thinking about this phrase, the ethics of biodiversity. So biodiversity is usually understood as the diversity of life at all levels. So at the very least, genetic diversity within populations, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And I don't need to remind this audience that the actions that people take at many scales, from local land use and management to landscape scale conservation to the extremely pressing issue of managing global climate change, have life or death implications for individual organisms, both human and more than human, as they say in the environmental humanities. And these potentially have broader effects on the diversity of species, the diversity of ecosystems. In the case of introduced and invasive species, what is often at stake is ecological diversity and the conservation of relatively isolated ecosystems, which I'll call islands in ecologists' extended biogeographic sense. So whether literal, like oceanic islands, or metaphorical, for example, in the sense that a lake can be a kind of island, or in the sense that long distance dispersal between continents would, for many species, be a quite rare event in the absence of humans moving them around, whether intentionally or inadvertently. So as I just mentioned before, to call a species population invasive in a place is to make pretty complex evaluative and ethical claims about it. So for example, in this wonderful title slide that Trouty cooked up, there's this image of North American beaver impacts in Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. So these beavers were introduced in the mid-20th century on an island for pelts, for which demand subsequently plummeted and this population exploded. Beavers are, like humans, ecosystem engineers, and they radically alter local environments through dam building, which expands wetlands, elevates the water table, increases the retention of sediment, which threatens some native species like southern beech trees, while providing habitat for often introduced plants as well as fish and bird species. Many environmentalists abhor these impacts. For example, the Chilean environmental philosopher Ricardo Rossi, who's argued that the introduced beavers threaten unique southern beech forest ecosystems. So invasion biologists generally appeal to the value of unique native species, ecosystems, and so on, the value of ecological diversity potentially threatened by introduced species to justify their concerns. So even some introduced plants are controversial. This is a picture I took in a conservation area in Victoria, Australia. And if you squint, you can see the little koala chilling in these eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees native to Australia have been called the universal Australian, as they've been introduced around the world and have sometimes caused pretty significant controversy, for example, in India, Spain, and in the US and California. The environmental journalist Emma Maris, who's been a prominent skeptic of conservationists and invasion biologists' focus on non-native species introductions, wrote in The Atlantic in 2016 on the controversy in California over Tasmanian blue gum eucalyptus, quote, "There is, to put it mildly, widespread disagreement about what to do with these trees. There's a faction of environmentalists that want to see many of these eucalyptus trees removed because they're a fire hazard close to homes or because they're non-native, make poor habitat for native species, or both. There's another faction of environmentalists that dispute that the trees are more of a fire hazard than what might replace them, see them as decent or even very valuable habitat, and want to retain them to sequester carbon, provide shade, beauty, and recreation, and to avoid the use of the herbicides that are generally necessary to thoroughly kill them off." So Maris, who has, I think, unfortunately been mislabeled a science denialist for questioning some of the claims made by invasion biologists, follows the environmental historian William Cronin and others in the environmental humanities and philosophy in rejecting the environmentalist ideal of wilderness. And she extends this critique to invasion biology. So in a more recent piece about nature documentaries, which I recommend, she says, quote, "I've questioned whether introduced species should be condemned simply because they weren't in an ecosystem when the first white man studied it. Sometimes people tell me I'm attacking a straw man, that no one believes in the idea of pristine wilderness anymore. Usually the people who say this work in fields such as conservation, restoration, and ecology, where exciting new findings in paleoecology, plus a belated but welcome interest in indigenous environmental history, have gradually changed the way they think about nature and humans' place in it. But outside that specialist world, I find that the wilderness myth lives on." So this wilderness myth, she believes, lives on in nature documentaries that often exclude any discussion or depiction of humans, except perhaps at the end as kind of nature destroyers. She thinks the wilderness myth is what justifies many people's concern with introduced species, since humans moving species across biogeographic barriers to dispersal makes recipient ecosystems less natural, untouched, or pristine. In a minute, I'll say more about why I think she's right that something like the wilderness ideal does motivate at least some invasion biologists' concern about introduced species, and why I actually also think that we should reject it, at least in a certain formulation. However, many are probably motivated by more mundane concerns about the economic, public health, or other ecological consequences of introduced species. And the worst cases, in turn, tend to be narrated in ways that are quite sensational. So this is a recent piece from the online magazine, The Conversation, that reports on these authors' hot off the presses study published in Nature on the, quote, "high and rising economic costs of biological invasions worldwide. Attack of the alien invaders, pest, plants, and animals leave a frightening $1.7 trillion bill," which is actually a number that is added up, with all of this data that they could get, existing data about costs from like 1970 until I think 2017 or around then. So this is, I think, a good example of the kind of rhetoric that some skeptics of invasion biology often attack as alarmist fear-mongering, with perhaps some worries about nativist or xenophobic undertones, although the authors are careful here to state that invasive species can come from anywhere, or at least any continent. Skeptics are also always quick to point out that these studies usually only look at costs of introduced species and don't consider benefits. Comparing these costs with, say, the benefits of introduced agricultural species might be interesting, although the meaning of that comparison would perhaps be as useless as decontextualized aggregate costs of the problem of invasions in general, which kind of adds together a lot of extremely diverse and fascinating pests. So for those curious, here's their figure for the costliest taxa. These are the most hated baddies of biodiversity, including, of course, the deadliest animal, mosquitoes, but then also rats, cats, termites, fire ants, the brown tree snake, and the boll weevil, among others. I think we should grant at the outset that Cronin and Maris are descriptively correct that wilderness, if it's understood as an area completely unaffected by humans, is indeed a myth. Since human migrations and then European settler colonialism and its associated ecological effects, what the historian Alfred Crosby called the Columbian Exchange, and then later ecological imperialism, affected biodiversity globally and possibly even the climate before the Industrial Revolution. So this is a table from Lewis and Maslin's Defining the Anthropocene, or the proposed geological epoch of humans, showing various anthropogenic impacts that can be seen in geological strata. Two are relevant here: the extinction of megafauna in the Pleistocene as humans spread around the world and hunted many of these big animals to extinction, all while using fire as a landscaping and hunting tool quite liberally. And for curious folks, of course, here's a map of the movements of people from Nielsen et al. Based on genomic data. And humans have, of course, been moving like their companion species, like dogs, with them for thousands of years, and probably many others. Barriers to dispersal be damned. And of course, the interesting, stuff that we know now about, mixing with Neanderthals and that kind of stuff after humans leave Africa. So this shows that humans have been having geologically discernible effects on biodiversity, the diversity of species, the composition and functioning of ecosystems for tens of thousands of years. And then secondly, the Orbis spike, or the 1610 carbon minima, as the European settler colonial invasion of the Americas beginning in 1492, through warfare and especially introduced diseases, took a really unimaginable demographic toll on indigenous peoples. The subsequent reforestation as complex agricultural societies collapsed that sucked carbon from the atmosphere is a hypothesized cause of the 1610 carbon minima and glacier ice, an event which may have precipitated some minor global cooling. In addition to their diseases and parasites, the Europeans brought a whole ecological complex with them, notably wheat, cows, pigs, and horses, who interestingly had evolved in the Americas before spreading to Eurasia, only to be reintroduced later. And they, of course, exported back to Eurasia food species like potatoes and tomatoes that had been domesticated by indigenous Americans, as well as possibly the disease syphilis. And enslaved or captive Africans also moved many species with them, especially plants that were useful for food and medicine. With a few obvious exceptions, movements of species were until very recently widely believed to generally be a good thing. And famously, some people in what Crosby called the Neo-Europes even formed acclimatization societies aimed at introducing European species to their settler colonies. While I don't want to make a pronouncement on the start date of the Anthropocene, or as some of my comrades on the environmental left would call it, the Capitalocene, This is all to say that to justify invasion biology's concern with introduced species, it won't work to appeal to a mythical wilderness, an environmental state before or absent the impacts of humans, since such impacts are indeed deeply historical and widespread. But this seems exactly what invasion biologists do when they define non-native species as those species that have arrived in a place through accidental or intentional introduction by humans, crossing, again, those barriers to dispersal, as opposed to other natural dispersal mechanisms like the wind or hitching a ride on or in a non-human animal. So beyond this descriptive issue with wilderness, there are plenty of normative issues, and I'll just mention a few here. Firstly is Cronin's famous kind of Nietzschean style debunking genealogy of wilderness and the changes in its valuation over time. So, beginning with this kind of biblical usage where wilderness is understood to be an uncultivated waste, which was used to, justify kind of dispossession of indigenous Americans, and its later revaluation as valuable nature being tied to this very culturally particular romantic aesthetic of the sublime, as well as a kind of masculinist fascination with the idea of a vanishing frontier. But I think, perhaps more importantly, like Cronin was getting at this idea that the wilderness ideal implies a pretty strict separation of humans from nature, which is, he thought, again, the result of this kind of construction over time. And I use this picture that I took at the Bald River Gorge Wilderness sometimes in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee to illustrate Cronin's points about wilderness, because of course, like, this is designated as a wilderness by humans. They have this sign here. I took this picture from a parking lot. People drive there, and then you take this path to a waterfall, which is exactly the kind of aesthetic of the sublime that Cronin was thinking about. And additionally, of course, like, this is a national forest named for people who were expelled and dispossessed. And so this wilderness ideal has been used to justify the kind of fortress conservation, which is like the pejorative name for the kind of national park model of conservation, and dispossession and displacement of indigenous and rural people for conservation, as documented by the wonderful environmental journalist Mark Dowie in his book, Conservation Refugees. So does the wilderness myth live on in invasion biology? Well, Maris is right in thinking that at least some invasion biologists do see non-natives per se as, quote, unnatural and undesirable, as can be seen in the survey data from Young and Larson. So 37% of reviewers surveyed from the journal Biological Invasions agreed with the statement that, quote, exotics are an unnatural, undesirable component of the biota and the environment. So if we take this survey to be an accurate reflection of invasion biologists, this is still a minority position, but a significant one. Indeed, many scholars have argued that invasion biologists assume kind of biological nativism, the idea that species belong in the biogeographic, region that they evolved and or dispersed naturally. That is where they are biogeographically native. So this is ecologist Ken Thompson's book, Where Do Camels Belong? Camels evolved 40 to 50 million years ago in North America, and actually dispersed widely and have been heavily domesticated. But there's a large wild population in Australia, introduced in the early 20th century for transport and since gone feral. So do camels belong in Australia? I will return to this towards the end of my talk. Perhaps nativism, like this kind of old school wilderness ideal, is a straw man, but the titles of these conservation texts focus on invasive species suggest that it's been a significant motivator. So like Strangers in Paradise, Nature Out of Place. Speaking of straw men, it's of course possible that what's going on here is a kind of appeal to nature fallacy, or what I call here like naive appeals to nature. The philosopher John Stuart Mill pointed out over 100 years ago that natural is sometimes taken to mean part of nature in the broadest sense, in which case humans and everything else in the observable universe is natural. Or it could be contrasted with artificial, in which case there will probably be degrees of artificiality or artifactuality, depending on the definitions we use. Either way, it's not going to do much normative work, since whether something is artificial doesn't tell us much about whether it's good or bad absent context. And something being a part of the natural world in the broadest sense is simply unavoidable, unless I guess you're God or whatever. So thus both of these arguments are bad. The idea that anthropogenic introductions are bad because they're unnatural. The introduction of tomato plants to Europe and Asia and elsewhere would thus be bad or wrong because they're unnatural. I think that's implausible. Similarly, the idea that, well, humans are part of nature in the broadest sense, so anthropogenic introductions are not bad because they're natural or because they've happened before. Of course, that's also kind of naive appeal to nature. Would suggest that, it would be fine for humans to just, continue to introduce pigs onto islands. And, that's, again, absent broader context and more about the values at stake. I think this is a bad argument. So the lesson here, of course, is that at least, in this, in the philosophical framework I'm adopting here, that we cannot read off of nature where a species belongs. This is a normative or ethical question, not a scientific one. So facts about biogeographic origin, where a species evolved, biogeographic barriers to dispersal, or evolutionary success or fitness or persistence in an environment, these are all facts that can be discovered through empirical investigation by scientists, I think, but they're not norms or values, at least in the absence of a broader set of evaluative or ethical claims. So let's say that we agree with Maris that conservationists should reject the wilderness ideal, at least as critiqued by Cronin and others. Is there any justification for invasion biologists caring about biogeographic origin? Well, one thing to say, I think, is that normative conceptions of place or valuable nature culture, as opposed to a kind of naive appeal to nature, still have a legitimate role to play in debates about introduced species. So I say nature culture here to emphasize, following Donna Haraway and others, that the nature culture dualism is questionable, as our sense of nature is, of course, mediated and constructed through culture, including scientific discourses. And as mentioned previously, we know has been irreversibly changed by humans. And our cultures are, of course, also part of nature in that broad sense, in the same way that, beaver dams are part of their extended phenotype. So valuable nature cultures can in some cases look like well-manicured gardens or agroecosystems. In other cases might look like minimally managed conservation areas, or Emma Maris's idea of the rambunctious garden, or areas traditionally maintained by indigenous peoples, but will always fall somewhere in between on kind of continua of human domination and control. So I think where species belong is intimately tied to the biocultural kind of sense of place, which can, and in some cases should be legitimately include considerations of natural history and ecology. Endemic species and their unique ecosystems in particular are sometimes threatened by introductions. For example, the sub-Antarctic southern beech forest altered by introduced North American beavers in Chile and Argentina, or the hemlocks of Eastern North America, or species on islands like Hawaii or New Zealand, or the unique fauna of Australia. The sense of place thus might include a kind of plausibly reconstructed sense of wilderness, just as Cronin thought his debunking genealogy did not obviate an appreciation for the wild otherness of nature in the broadest sense, even growing in the cracks of our built environment. I also think, part of my interest in introduced species is that there's something appealing about them kind of for similar reasons. They represent unique natural cultural lineages, and the kind of twists and turns of their social and biological histories are fascinating, if sometimes, terrifying and sad. On the other hand, normative conceptions of place and nature, of course, can and have been tied to social nativism, xenophobia, and racism. So Peter Coates's book, Strangers on the Land, American Perceptions of Immigrant and Invasive Species, documents connections between attitudes towards human immigrants and introduced species in the US, and feminist science studies scholars like Banu Subramaniam have argued that the same kind of rhetoric and discourses used to demonize and dehumanize human immigrants are used to demonize introduced species. They take resources from natives, they breed rapidly, etc. Recently, the previous US president called COVID-19 a, quote, foreign virus and the China virus, appealing to his xenophobic political base and contributing to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and referred to migrants and refugees fleeing desperate circumstances as an invasion. So I'm often troubled by the slippage between social categories like national boundaries and biogeographic or ecological ones, even at the level of continents, given the history of pseudoscientific racism's continental races, beginning with Linnaeus and Blumenbach. I also always wince seeing references to the invasive gypsy moth, since gypsy is now considered a slur by Roma people, and concerns about so-called Africanized killer bees raise obvious ethical questions about terminology in the context of anti-Black racism in the US and elsewhere. An example of this kind of combination of biological and social nativism is the Danish-American landscape and garden architect Jens Jensen, who said in 1937, this is quoted by Stephen Jay Gould, that, quote, "The gardens that I created myself shall be in harmony with their landscape environment and the racial characteristics of its inhabitants." So while Coates concludes that contemporary invasion biologists and conservationists are concerned with ecological and other impacts of introduced species and are not motivated by social nativism or xenophobia, more subtle connections are still being debated and are a part of my current research. The historical connections between biogeography and scientific racism, and between racism and certain strands of environmentalism associated with eugenics in the US and Germany, have been well documented by historians and have been discussed and debated by invasion biologists. In general, I think normative conceptions of valuable nature, like wilderness, are really indispensable, but need to be scrutinized and the values underlying them made clear. In some cases, they may be well justified. In others, they might rest on mistaken beliefs about natural history, ecosystems, or evolution, as Stephen Jay Gould believed the preference for native plants did. Or it could be unexamined xenophobia or social nativism. But logically speaking, there's no necessary connection between these. Indeed, in my own case, I'm a staunch proponent for open borders for humans, but would agree with invasion biologists in pointing to history to advocate some caution in moving species around. This logical point is also why I'm skeptical of recent attempts by some scholars to connect the preference for native species with, quote, decolonization in the Americas, or as the environmental philosopher Ned Hedinger does, rely on analogies between human immigration and the movement of species to define ecologically native in normative terms. At a more abstract level from the particular sense of place, invasion biologists, again, are concerned not just by species loss or the loss of species diversity, which is due in large part to introduced predators, especially on islands, but also the loss of ecological diversity. So while species introductions may increase local or even regional species richness, they often have the effect of homogenizing ecological communities across areas. This is why invasion biologists have worried about the homogenocene, or the prospect of a planet of weeds. Elton wrote in The Ecology of Invasions that, quote, "If we look for enough ahead, the eventual state of the biological world will become not more complex, but simpler and poorer. Instead of 6 continental realms of life with all their minor components of mountaintops, islands, and fresh waters, separated by barriers to dispersal, There will be only one world, with the remaining wild species dispersed up to the limits set by their genetic characteristics, not to the lower limits set by mechanical barriers as well. So Elton is here, talking about the conservation of islands in that extended biogeographic sense. So I guess, if there are any birders in the audience, I guess this nightmare scenario would be like starlings everywhere, the bane of birders everywhere. Although I think Rachel Carson argued that they should be given honorary native status. So invasion biologists might appeal to the aesthetic, scientific, and other values of ecological diversity as a distinct kind of biological diversity, although the values of ecological novelty through the creation of so-called novel ecosystems, I think, would also have to be reckoned here. However, I'd argue the most important considerations for judging introduced species are their impacts, which are quite diverse and depend on the unique characteristics of the species and the recipient ecosystem. The ecologist Mark Davis and some of his colleagues caused a bit of a stir a few years ago when they argued that conservationists shouldn't judge species on their origins, but rather their impacts. Indeed, it's been known for decades now that only a small minority of introduced species even successfully establish. And of those that do, only a small minority become problematic invaders. This is the rule of tens. Roughly, only about a tenth of introduced species establish, and of those, only a tenth roughly become problematic. Obviously, some native species can become pests, although this is often as a result of disturbance. For example, the removal of predators to white-tailed deer in North America. Some invasion biologists responded to this in the literature by arguing that biogeographic origin can sometimes be useful in predicting those impacts. So I say here the epistemic relevance of biogeographic origin due to various origin effects, like longstanding human association adaptation, the idea from Elton of kind of unbalanced ecosystems, like outrunning a predator. Fridley and Sachs, Dove Sachs here at Brown has discussed a kind of evolutionary imbalance hypothesis where basically larger areas that can support greater biodiversity have heavier kind of Darwinian competition for the conversion of resources into offspring. And so there could be just basic things about evolution and kind of area and size. There's also just a sampling effect. So the more species you move across biogeographic barriers, the more likely it is that you'll hit on one that will have, some really bad effect. But how should we judge the impacts of introduced species? So in my remaining time, I'd like to, finish up by talking about and advocating for a kind of pluralistic approach and discussing the dilemmas of managing populations of introduced sentient vertebrates like cats, pigs, or camels. So generally, the pluralist in environmental ethics says that there are many diverse considerations, both anthropocentric or human-centered and non-anthropocentric or non-human-centered, that are relevant to judgments of environmental harm, and also judgments about the management of introduced species. So this anthropocentrism, non-anthropocentrism distinction I take to be compatible with these values being anthropogenic in the sense that they're our human cultural values, even though we can, and I think we should, care about non-human or more than human individual species and ecosystems for their own sake. So these considerations, again, listed here, right? Human well-being and economic values, often called ecosystem services, aesthetic and scientific values, environmental justice, especially the ideas of environmental rights that people have. So right to environmental health, maybe collective rights to environmental self-determination, normative conceptions of place or nature culture, as I mentioned earlier. And then, relatedly, the kind of care ethics ideas of, meeting needs, partiality, and associated environmental virtues. So I take all of those to be anthropocentric, and then under kind of non-anthropocentric considerations, we ought to take into account psychological well-being of sentient organisms, the biological welfare of non-humans who might not be sentient, and then the integrity and stability of non-human populations, species, and ecosystems. So in environmental ethics, we often distinguish between views about value in the environment in terms of intrinsic value, which I would gloss as whatever we have a reason to value for its own sake, or things that deserve respect for what they are, their value not exhausted by instrumental value for humans or some other end. And so within these debates, there are more individualist views like those taken by the sentientists, or individualist biocentrists who advocate for the rights or consideration of interests of all sentient or living beings, respectively, and more holist views like those of Aldo Leopold, who emphasize considerations of the land or ecosystems as a whole, as well as species populations and lineages. I think the most plausible position is a pluralist one that, again, tries to take all of these into account in some way, because I think we have good reasons to value all of these things for their own sake, whether because they're alive or merely sentient, or because they are the amazing, complex results of evolutionary processes over deep time. Unfortunately, of course, for the pluralists, this results in difficult dilemmas, like managing, feral pigs, which, according to USDA, feral hogs cost about $1.5 billion a year in estimated damage to agriculture and infrastructure, and also come into conflict with native species and wildlife, including some endangered species. So the ecologist quoted here, Mark Lashley, is right that there is a scientific consensus about these impacts, but on the other hand, feral pigs are sentient, intelligent creatures that ought to be treated with respect. My former colleague, the ethicist and animal studies scholar Jeff Sebo, recently co-wrote a piece entitled "Stop Treating Animals as Invaders Just for Trying to Exist." My view is that a plausible pluralism rules out the most radical individualist animal rights or ecologically holist views because they don't recognize the other competing values at stake. I reject the idea that animals have inviolable rights, but I agree with Sebo and others that their interests ought to be taken into account. There are certainly better and worse ways to lethally control feral pigs, as the Australians discovered when they used the blood thinner warfarin, and the pigs suffered really horrible, clearly painful deaths. I also don't believe they should be completely eradicated, even if they could be. As I mentioned earlier, I think these populations constitute interesting and unique new kind of natural cultural lineages. Similarly, individual camels and the unique lineage of feral camels in Australia deserve respect. However, as the population of feral camels in Australia grows, the ecological damage to vegetation, water quality, et cetera, becomes significant. There's also damage to the social and cultural values of Aboriginal people, including water holes and bush tucker or traditional sources of food. Again, this pluralistic approach is going to rule out the most radical animal rights or ecologically holist views because they don't recognize the competing values at stake. Just quickly go to the next slide because I think I'm running short on time here. Similarly, there's a huge controversy around the management of feral cats, especially on islands like the Galapagos, which is where this recent conference at UPenn convened by philosophers of biology got its title, "Killing Cats to Save Finches." I think it's unfortunate. Some advocates for free roaming cats often spread disinformation, misinformation. I don't know if it rises to the level of science denialism as these scholars argue. One recent example kind of surprised me. In their book on animal rights and political theory, Zoopolis, the philosophers Donaldson and Kimlicka make the claim that if you eradicate cats in one area, this could be counterproductive because this will just create a vacuum of suitable habitat for cats to come in from elsewhere, and will also increase their rate of reproduction because cats are somehow able to regulate their reproduction in response to stress at the meta population level, no less, such that they'll increase their litter size and you'll have more cats to deal with in the end. There is some, suggestive evidence for effects like this in certain limited cases, but these kinds of arguments have always struck me as biologically and ecologically misinformed. And a quick Google search for studies on the conservation efficacy of feral cat control, could attest to this. In any event, I think the pluralist position helps make sense of the difficulty of these dilemmas. The kind of single-minded ethicist who clings to individualism or just a holism is actually missing something. I think these are hard choices, which of course could have been prevented, which leads to conclusion. So concerns about introduced species, I think sometimes are justified and sometimes are not. But the worst invasions from low probability, high impact introductions suggest the importance of precaution and prevention. A pluralistic evaluation of risks and harms and justifications of management, I think, is warranted, but then also suggests important roles for democracy and deliberation in decision-making alongside scientific expertise. So there are some issues that I'm thinking about. Ethics of the use of novel biotechnologies for management. This is the idea that we could use CRISPR and gene drives to manage or even eradicate some of these populations without having to kill any individual. The value of ecological diversity versus ecological novelty, debates about compassionate conservation, etc. Thank you all so much for listening. I look forward to your questions. This is a picture of Maine's iconic rocky coast, similar to Rhode Island, which is rocky due to herbivory by introduced periwinkles, which I only recently learned, even though I grew up rambling on these rocks. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
David, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific. As I said in my introduction, as I think you know, I always learn so much from you, from your informed, your subtle thought, and I'm really grateful. I really appreciate what you're calling your pluralistic approach. So thank you for that. You gave us a lot to think about, and there's I don't know if we'll get through all the questions today, but you've really have generated a host of wonderful questions. So let's get started right away. One of our guests, Catherine, asks, there is currently discussion on the risk-reward trade-offs involved using CRISPR-based technologies to deal with invasive species. What are your thoughts on this, on both the pragmatic and the ethical levels?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks, Catherine, so much for that question. So yeah, this is an issue I've been thinking about, and people are just writing papers like crazy about this topic. So they're just coming out. There's a flurry of papers. I've just finished reading some of these. The worry that I think is the most significant is that if you introduce a gene, let's say, that makes all the offspring male, which is like one possibility for allowing the population to decline using CRISPR, that this gene might eventually get out and get to actually all of the other populations on the planet. And so one of the recent papers that I found really interesting on this topic was basically saying that this is only justified if we would actually be okay with a global extinction, which might only be justified for like some of these like really horrible like cases like mosquitoes, where I know they're doing CRISPR tests to make them less suitable vectors for disease, which I think is great. But then other people have also argued that we should just eradicate them globally, which I have obviously mixed feelings about, even for mosquitoes, but I would worry about that worst case scenario if we decided to, for example, use it for feral pigs or for raccoons in Europe or something like that. And so, yeah, the paper I'm thinking of is really interesting. And so, Catherine, if you want to email me, I can send you a link to that, or we can chat more about it.
Great. Thanks, David. And thanks, Catherine, for that wonderful question. Okay, here's another question. This is from Roxanne. Would the anti-GMO stance be a continuation of the negative connotations of anthropogenic, quote unquote, tampering with nature?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the idea that it is fundamentally wrong to intervene in nature just can't, that as a general principle can't be right. So if there are issues with GMOs, I think, you know, a lot of them have to do with the political economy of agriculture, and questions about nature and tampering with nature, I think are less, certainly less salient kind of for me philosophically, given that I accept that kind of Millian kind of approach to thinking about nature and the concept. But yeah, I mean, people who discuss this in the philosophical literature often make the point that, you know, even if, so I mean, humans have been modifying, you know, genetically modifying species that we've domesticated for a really long time. You know, that again, that doesn't justify using, you know, genetic engineering technologies, but I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic about the potential use of GMOs than others might be in environmentalist circles. But I also take especially those considerations about kind of political economy and kind of who owns and controls these organisms pretty seriously. So, but thanks.
All right, thank you very much. So the response and the question. So here's a question from Michaela. So now we'll find out just how pluralistic you are, David. So the question is, do you think a conversation between ecology and panpsychism could disrupt the normative conceptions of place?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, panpsychism is the idea that like everything is conscious. And there's, I think, a kind of panpsychism at work when some biocentrists argue that the line, drawing the line at sentience is perhaps not recognizing the ways that plants and other non-sentient organisms act intelligently, respond to their environments, are certainly engaged in many cases in like cognition, if not conscious cognition, the same way that maybe humans are. But yeah, I think it probably could disrupt those normative conceptions of place, especially if not just the living world is taken to be conscious, but the abiotic environment as well. And I think like this idea that all of creation or all of existence is somehow sacred is maybe getting at this idea. And if you believe that, of course, that might pose a problem for a kind of special attachment to a particular place, because of course, you know, those things change. And if everything is conscious, I guess that might be, yeah, you might have a lot of difficulty kind of distinguishing different places, I think, as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it really is. And that's a wonderful response. Thanks, David. Now here's a question from Nicholas. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Can you clarify the relationship between biodiversity and place when it comes to invasion biology? Is the value of particular ecological niches one particular interpretation of biodiversity, for example? Or are there other reasons to value place besides its value as an interpretation of biodiversity?
Thanks, Nicholas. Wonderful question. I think we could spend an entire semester talking about this question. I think it really gets into interesting debates about the value of biodiversity and kind of conceptions of biodiversity. So the way that I was thinking about it in the talk was that invasion biologists generally care about this kind of differentiation at the level of ecosystems. So the kind of special, unique ecosystems that exist, for example, on islands where there's the really significant barriers to dispersal, or that distinguish the fauna of different continents that have been separated by the seams of Pangea. And so the value of ecological diversity, I think, is like a more kind of general or abstract way of conceiving this idea that what is at stake are these unique systems. But I think you're right that there are lots of other reasons to value place besides its value kind of as it contributes to some global ecological diversity. And many of those could be tied to particular cultures. So like many indigenous peoples, like consider their relationship to the land as kind of constitutive of their culture. And so in those cases, I think their value of that place is very much tied up with the value of their cultural heritage and all of that. And so, yeah, I think there are many other reasons we could kind of riff on this, I think, for a long time, but I'll just leave it there. But thanks, Nicholas.
It's really fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so here's another question from Teresa. A problem with relying on the 1/10 species rule is that they may not become problematic for 100 years or more. There is no way to know at introduction which species will become problematic for the native species, for example, stiltgrass, multiflora rose.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. This is a point that Dan Simberloff likes to make as well. And I think there's something to it, particularly if we're thinking about like the really long-term implications of moving species around and like plants in particular onto continents, where like I don't think there have been documented plant extinctions on continents due to competition with, you know, introduced plants. But a lot of invasion biologists worry that there's this time lag. And so you could get in 200, 300, 400 years, again, there's this worry that you're going to end up with this kind of planet of weeds. I mentioned the one in, or the rule of tens partly to sort of contextualize the risk, because I think what invasion biologists are worried about are the kind of like those worst case scenarios, especially. And I think that does justify caution and precaution in moving species around. And I mean, you're absolutely right. We don't know we can't predict with certainty the precise impacts, but one of the things I was looking into when I was working with the Simberloff lab was biocontrol. And so this is the introduction of non-native species to control other either introduced species or pest species. And so we were looking at the introduction of these beetles that eat the woolly adelgid, the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so, you know, the kinds of risk assessments that that you have to go through if you want to introduce a species for biocontrol tend to be pretty rigorous. And those involve testing for host specificity, looking at you know, phylogenetically related possible off-target hosts. And so like in those cases, I think we can maybe do a risk assessment. But yeah, I think you're right that the kind of long-term implications for many of these are just unknown, and we'll have to see. And that I think also is a motivation for that kind of precautionary approach.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're going to go from beetles to worms for the next question. So Eleni, she asks, she says, this is a completely practical question. Can David talk about jumping worms? I learned of their existence last year because there are thousands of them in my garden, maybe more, thousands of them in my garden here in Providence. What's findable on them is doomsday-ish. How bad are they, and what do I do? I'm terrified of spreading them to local forests on my shoes, etc.
Okay, thank you for that. I actually have no idea
Okay.
what she's referring to, but I would be happy to look into it, and you should email me. So my email is david_frank@brown.edu. So please email me. I would love to look into this and have a chat about it. I just got a book in the mail on the long-term fate of invasive species that discusses the case of introduced earthworms, but I don't think those, like, these are a different species, like the jumping worms. So there's so many of these case studies. It's like you could spend, I mean, one of the things I love about this field is like just the stories and how fascinating they are. So yeah, please get in touch with me and I'd be happy to look into that. And we can maybe see if we can come up with a good plan for you.
You'll have to report back to all of us on that.
I will. Yeah, I will.
Great. So there's a question from Carlos. Thank you for this great lecture diving into complexity. We live in times of growing awareness of eco-historical injustices. We're promoting long overdue land and displacement acknowledgements, as well as revising labels such as aliens to refer to immigrants. What are some political implications you see to including humans inside a concept of nature? What blurring of obsolete and/or need is there for new ethical concepts to ensue?
Wow, another wonderful question that we could spend a semester talking through. And I really appreciate the kind words about the talk, Carlos. So political implications to including humans inside a concept of nature. So one would be to recognize, I think, the rights of indigenous people to manage their lands, and to maybe reform or revise our sense of wilderness in a way that is much more in those sort of shades of gray, which I think Cronin was already doing and people have been doing since then. And so I'm not sure if I'm going to say anything new, but yeah, I think those are kind of two really important ones. And then, new ethical concepts. Well, people have talked about novel ecosystems, and that's another kind of issue I've been, dipping my toes into, and I intend to, read kind of the big book about it this summer. But yeah, this idea of novel ecosystems and the question of kind of like the value of these natural cultural lineages, I think is interesting. And so that, I think, is maybe something that I have kind of presented in this talk that might be relevant, which again, kind of, I think goes along with this general trend toward seeing biodiversity not just as native biodiversity, which it had been for a long time, but including, introduced, naturalized, and other, non-native populations.
Great. Thanks, David. Can we go a bit more? Can we go till 5:15? You holding up?
Of course. Okay? Yeah, no, you have me till at least 5:15, Mark.
Okay, great. So here's wow, this is a wonderful question from Emily. Thanks, David. I was just wondering whether you might be able to say more about what sort of framework guides a pluralistic evaluation. For example, how to weigh the different values, whether they are commensurable, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. It's a really wonderful question. I argued in my dissertation many years ago that you could construct commensurability in some of these contexts, and I think you can in pretty limited circumstances, but I don't think that these values are all commensurable. And that is why I suggest at the end that one of pluralism's, what many of the philosophers who've written about pluralism advocate for are these deliberative and democratic processes that allow all of these considerations to sort of have voice, and then processes of decision making that are also kind of democratic and include many stakeholders. Now, of course, what happens through that process might be very different from like my sense from thinking about all these considerations and trying to weigh them up. The other thing to say, right, is that for any individual, like this is a perfect kind of like, this is a case for that kind of Aristotelian practical wisdom that I know, Emily, you study Aristotle. So I think that's another maybe interesting thing to think about in the development of this kind of pluralistic view, is developing a more detailed theory of both those kind of processes at the social decision-making level, and then that kind of like practical reasoning and deliberation at the individual level. But yeah, the world is too complicated for algorithms, I think is I think very, very plausible, and it's a philosophical insight, I think.
Great. Thanks, David. That question really went to the heart of things. That's great. So here's a question from Lucas. Fascinating talk. What a wonderful research project. My question is about your distinction between anthropocentric and more cosmopolitan considerations. My question is how we adjudicate cases in which human and more than human interests do not align. Similarly, within our own species, what about cases in which different communities have different considerations and interests that motivate different policy decisions?
Thank you, Lucas. Wonderful, wonderful question. And I should thank Lucas for and Bathsheba as well for allowing me to sit in on their environmental humanities seminar, which was a really wonderful experience. And I really appreciated that. So on the question of cases in which different communities have different considerations and interests that motivate different policy decisions, I would say, again, like appealing to some of those procedural kinds of answers. So like in many other areas, we want to have institutions that allow people to deliberate publicly and ideally to have democratic voice in deciding what happens with land management. And so I would hope that conflicts could be peacefully resolved through those kinds of institutions. On the case of human and more than human interests not aligning, I mean, a wonderful example of this obviously would be like a farmer and feral pigs, right? So feral pigs are kind of notorious for their rooting behavior and for like taking out enormous amounts of agricultural products like in a single night. They're kind of amazing. And so in those cases, I would certainly like there to be solutions that would not rise to the level of kind of lethal management. And those kinds of like peaceful coexistence kinds of strategies do exist in some cases. But I'm also like, I think ultimately these are kind of philosophically incommensurable, and I wouldn't want to ask a farmer to like sacrifice their interests for these, I think, important non-human values. But yeah, in practical kinds of cases of conflict, I think they're just very difficult, and trying to come up with those kinds of creative, kinds of less violent solutions, I think is an important kind of first step.
David, thank you so much. Thanks to all the participants who attended today. It's really still a busy time in the semester. It's not over yet. We do have, I just want to say there's a lot more questions. So I kind of have the painful task now of bringing this wonderful program to a close. I did want to read the last comment are jumping worms springtails? So this is something that we'll all have to do a little research on. But David, again, I just learned so much. We all did. So thank you very much. And I hope everyone who was part of this presentation today, this event, I hope you'll come back to Environmental Humanities to join us, and come back next spring when there's going to be this wonderful conference that David is really being instrumental in organizing, a wonderful conference on a similar topic in terms of the very language of invasive species, and better language that we can come up with, better approaches and policy that can reflect this more innovative, normative thought on these really important issues. Thank you, David. I hope everyone out there is well and safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.